Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I am so excited. For those who do not know me and those who do, my name is Melanie Pagan. I use she and they pronouns, and I am one of the assistant deans and the Office of Student Affairs at SIPA, which is Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. I'm so excited to be able to introduce our amazing keynote speaker. And so before we start, I actually really want to thank everyone for engaging with us all week long. We've had an amazing time. I am so proud of the SIPA students of color who have organized such an amazing conference. One that was tricky to organize during a virtual setting. And so we're really just excited of all the conversations that we've been able to have. And so this year in particular, as you may all know, the conference really just comes at a very important point in the United States and in the world. Everything from the US political climate, Black Lives Matter movement, the effects of COVID-19 have created this disastrous I can't even say it, the disastrous mix and opportunity for change. We are heartened to witness this type of solidarity during this time take place in so many forms, which is why this year the students of color have identified the theme of our conference as Alliance. And so to close us off for this wonderful week, but very much the very start of so many more conversations, we have the amazing DeRay Mckesson, which I think you might have known DeRay, that I actually was at Yale when you taught there for a bit. So it was very exciting that you were able to join us. DeRay Mckesson is a civil rights activist who focuses primarily on issues of innovation, equity, and justice. Born and raised in Baltimore, DeRay graduated from Bowdoin College and holds an honorary doctorates from both the New School as well as the Maryland Institute College of Art. DeRay has advocated for issues related to children, youth, family since he was a teen. As a leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement and a co-founder of Campaign Zero, DeRay's work has focused on connecting individuals with knowledge and tools and provide citizens and policymakers with a common sense policies that ensure equity. He has been praised by President Obama for his work as a community organizer, has advised officials at all levels of the government and internationally, and continues to provide capacity to activists, organizers, influencers to make an impact. Spurred by the death of Mike Brown and the protests in Ferguson and beyond, DeRay has become a key player in the work to confront the systems and structures that have led to mass incarceration and police killing of Black and other minority populations. He is also the host of award-winning weekly podcast, Pod Save the People, which creates a space for conversation about the most important issues of the week related to justice, equity, and identity. DeRay frequently appears on national media outlets, including The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, NPR, CNN, among so many others. He is also featured on the cover of The Advocate, Ad Weekly, Attitude Magazine, and has been highlighted in a range of publications, including Vogue, Vanity Fair, Interview Magazine, Vice, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Baltimore Sun. He is a board member of Rock the Vote and was named one of the world's greatest leaders by Fortune magazine in 2015, one of the most 30 influential people of the internet by Time magazine in 2016, and so much more. And so we're really excited that you are with us here, DeRay. As you know, we are a policy school, and so the work that you do very specifically speaks to our student population and the mission and goals of our school and what we hope to educate our students as future policy leaders and folks who influence policy. And so without further ado, I will hand it off to DeRay. And once we have concluded, we will actually open up for a Q&A. And so please feel free to send any questions at any point, and I will make sure to ask at the end of our talk. Thank you.
Cool. It's an honor to be here. I'm gonna go through some stuff. I want to leave as much time for Q&A because, I'm hopeful that there are questions or pushes or ideas. We haven't figured this all out, so it's always good to be around people who, for whom policy is like their thing. It is like the way you come to the work. So I'm excited about that. Let me just start by here we go. A little keynote. So there are a couple things that animate our work. There's first of three sort of core beliefs. First is we believe that we can win in this lifetime, that this is not like a 500-year thing. It's not a 200-year thing, that like we can organize and win in this lifetime. The second is that we believe that the only way that outcomes change is if structures change. And the third is that we believe that the question is how to eat an elephant. And you've heard this before. The answer is one bite at a time. Now, we know that there's a version that says one bite after another. We'll never win that way. That if you bite in January, bite in July, like we're screwed. The elephant will heal. The version that we believe in says that everybody bites at the same time. So we think about all of these strategies being in play at one time. We think about all of these concerted efforts around legislation, around policy. We know that the only way to break the system of policing or to think about justice differently, writ large, is actually to put the full weight of community onto the system. The police is how I enter the conversation. I know the conference is about much more than this one issue, so I will use them as my entrance. But we will talk about a lot of things. Now, I'm always sensitive to the fact that people come at this from a multitude of perspectives. And like I said, I'm always open to pushes. Before we started, I used to teach sixth grade math. Sixth grade is great. Sixth grade is by far the best grade in middle school to teach. And I'll never forget, I taught 60, 90, and 120-minute classes, which is a lot of sixth grade math for anybody, a lot of math for anybody. And one day my students were like, can we go to gym early? And I'm like, sure. We've been together for an hour. We have another 30 minutes together. Like, gym teacher's one of my best friends. Have fun in gym. And then they come back really quick. And I'm like, why y'all back? And I realize that they're in love with the idea of gym more than the work of gym. And I think that there are a lot of moments where people are in love with the idea of justice and not the work of justice. So what I want to do is talk through what we've learned about the work, where we think the work comes in, what's the hard parts, what are the parts that people aren't talking about. I'll start with here. So I am a gay black man and an activist and, live in this world. And people ask me all the time, they're like, DeRay, why do people focus so much on issues of identity? This should be about policing, right? Like the protests were about policing. Mike Brown was policing. George Floyd was policing. Like, why are people talking about queer and trans and a range of identities? And one of the things that I'm reminding people is that we are trying to disrupt the institution of policing as much as we're trying to disrupt the logic of policing. We're trying to disrupt the logic of policing as much as we're trying to disrupt the institution. The logic of policing, in parentheses, because there is really no logic to racism and institutional challenges, but the logic says that there are a set of people who make the rules, policies, and practices, and they often have the most power, and they enforce those rules, policies, and practices often violently on people with less power and people from marginalized identities. That logic, that's like the policing logic in a nutshell. What is transphobia if not heteronormative values set by a set of people who hold power enforced violently on other people? What is homophobia if not heteronormative values are violently enforced on other people? So we remind people that the reason why we talk about identity in moments where policing always rises up is because at the core of both of them is a logic that says people with more power make decisions for people with less power, and that they enforce those decisions violently and at scale. Now, as we go on, I'll talk about this idea of what it means to never let the system off the hook. But I'll have you look at this for a second. We're gonna we haven't publicized this yet. It'll come out in a week or so, but it is a reminder that the police actually killed more people in 2020 than almost every year that we have data for. It's second only to 2018. And this is a reminder, and you can appreciate this, people study policy, is that the news will have you believe one thing, and then the real world is just a completely different thing. So, if you only watch the news from this summer, if you saw all of the attention and the protests and the magazine covers and the coverage, you might think that something got better. You might think that the police killed less people, but that's actually not what happened. The police killed more people last year. There was no dip during quarantine, COVID, lockdown, or the protests when we think about it. And who would have thought that 2020 would have actually been one of the highest years that we had any recorded data on? Now, you might ask, what about before 2013? Remember, there's no data before 2013, so we don't know who got killed by the police before 2013 at the national level, but we have very good data from 2013 to today. And like I said, this is this idea that we never let the system off the hook. that we do this analysis at the end of every year too, to remind people just about the frequency and the sheer breadth of the problem. You look at March and July, the police actually killed somebody every single day in those months. There was no break. Both of those months are COVID months. And July is definitely a protest month, but a reminder that like the problem is relentless. Now, there are three big databases of police violence in the US. And this is interesting for how we think about data collection writ large. So I'll talk about it with the police and then talk about some things that we've also been interested in. So we think about these three databases. The Washington Post is one of the most popular. The Washington Post only codes on-duty killings that include a gun. George Floyd's not in that database because he wasn't killed with a gun. If you remember Jean Botham was killed by Amber Geiger when she walked in and killed him on the couch. She was off duty when she killed him, so he is not in the database. And the Washington Post also codes you as armed if you had anything in your hand at the time of death. So this means that Tamir Rice is coded as armed. It means that there's a guy with a bucket in his hand. He's coded as armed. There's a guy who, there's a kid actually who had a Nintendo controller in his hand. He's coded as armed. So we like the Post, but the Post data we think is a little misleading for the problem. Fatal Encounters is the other big database. Fatal Encounters counts essentially anybody who dies in the presence of police. So die by suicide, if you die in a barricade situation, the police are present, they count you. And we think that's an incredibly rich data set. We think that that is not what people believe when they hear killed by police. We run mapping police violence, which is on duty, off duty, all weapons, where an officer was actively involved in the death of another person. Now, what's interesting about this is that when we zoom out and talk about a lot of the work around race and justice, we see disparities everywhere. So I just, on the podcast, it's not out yet. I think it comes out in 2 weeks, but we just did an interview with one of the leading scholars on glaucoma and the way that glaucoma impacts people of color differently, why it does. There's not as much data out. There's not as much access out there for eye doctors across the country because glaucoma is something that you don't really feel until it gets too late. So you got to go get checked up. Same thing with amputations, which is interesting. Same thing with clinical trials. Like there's the way we collect the data often shapes so much of how public policy moves, which is a lesson you already know. And that is also true when we think about these issues around police. The data is not really disaggregated by gender all that well or sexual orientation, not because people don't want to, but all three of these databases are from media reports. So the government doesn't collect this data. And there's a federal law requiring it, but the consequence for not complying is that the DOJ will withhold money from you. And no DOJ has ever withheld money from the police, regardless of their compliance with the laws. Trump was actually the only president almost willing to withhold money from the police, and it was for something random. So when we think about the data, it is always interesting to think about the things that we care about with regard to race and justice and how the data either supports, doesn't support, helps us, doesn't help us. And there are things like coroners. You probably know what a coroner is from like CSI. Coroners decide the cause of death. Only 4 states in the US require the coroner to be a medical professional. In places like California, the coroner is the sheriff, which is not good. So if somebody dies in jail, the sheriff has no incentive to say they got murdered. So that's not helpful. Or places like the sheriffs, they will actually release people early if they know they're going to die so that it doesn't show up as a jail-related death. So there's a lot around how we think about data and the intersections of race, justice, gender, and identity. Now, this is always interesting because another thing that we do in this work, right, is that we dispel myths. Is that so much of our work is telling people what's true and what's not true. People don't realize that the police actually kill more people in suburban communities than almost all other communities combined. It's not cities. Cities is actually like the only place that it's getting better. But cities are the hotbed of the media story. Cities are where most of the activism is concentrated. And cities, as you can imagine, are the places where the results are. But rural and suburban communities are actually the places where the problem is, most acute. You think about Maryland, where I'm from, and where I live. In Maryland, Baltimore County killed more people than any jurisdiction in the state. It's not Baltimore City. When we look at no-knock data in the state of Maryland, Baltimore City is the 4th highest. It's not the 1st, the 2nd, or 3rd. People think about cities because that's what we've been taught to believe when we think about these issues of race and justice as being hotbeds. But what we learn is that so much of it is actually not cities, that there's something about the suburbs that is actually particularly alarming, and the suburbs get off the hook in these conversations. Now, back to this idea that we never let the system off the hook, we're reminded that systems function because structures function in a certain way. Systemic injustice is rarely the result of like a person who doesn't like somebody. It's normally a result of a structure that allows bad people to do bad things or a system that doesn't let good people do good things. So you think about in Columbus, Ohio. In Columbus, a complaint must be received within 60 days of the alleged event. And the wild part about this is that in places like Columbus, a lot of complaints get thrown out because they don't even know they have 60 days. They have no clue. So, say you get put in a coma for 59 days by a police officer. If you don't do it, the next day it's automatically thrown out. People who are victims of sexual assault, people who might need counseling and therapy, like a complaint is not the first thing on their mind. But the police have actually written the rules such that it is almost impossible to hold them accountable. So what we say about the police and a whole host of other things is that it's not even that the police um, are above the law. It's that the police have their own laws, right? Like they literally have a whole different set of rules and procedures that we fight against. And when I think about the relationship between this and justice, is that so many of these things go hidden. People don't see them. People don't know. People don't understand. But this is the way that systems function. So we spend a lot of time trying to peel back, trying to help people understand that the injustices you see around any intersection of your identity is rarely happenstance, is rarely the result of just like one sort of annoying person or bad person. It is often or almost always the result of a system that encodes that behavior. We also ask questions to challenge narratives. It's a core part of our work. So I'll give you a second to look at this. So the thing about this is that, there's this idea that most of the people who come in proximity to the police must have been engaged in violent crime. And even when we parse the data and even when we're lenient in the coding, that's just not true. You think about the 94 people killed who it was a mental health check or a wellness check, the traffic stops, the domestic disturbances, the nonviolent offenses, it's actually not violence. And because you're policy people, I can tell you, traffic stops are really interesting. Probably 50 years ago, there's a study that came out that said that 1 in 3 officers who are killed is killed at a traffic stop. This guy did like a random not study about it. He sort of says, I didn't do a randomized control. I didn't really have a lot of data, but he does this idea that traffic stops are dangerous for the police. And the idea of the dangerous traffic stop becomes a set narrative. It is in Hollywood. You've seen it, this idea that the police are anxious when they pull people over. There's a scholar at the University of Alabama who recently did a study trying to figure out are traffic stops really dangerous? And it's something like 1 in a couple million traffic stops actually results in the felonious killing of a police officer. It's not a thing, but it was like this random study that the police put out that made it a thing for people, and people just believed it. There's actually a lot of that in policing. There's a lot of that in general. Same thing with the wait time. You've probably seen places where officers can't be interrogated immediately. They get 48 hours. In places like Maryland, they used to get 10 days. In Louisiana, they get 30 days. And you look at that and you're like, where'd that come from? We were like, where'd that come from? Where it came from was that there was a guy, Bill Lewinsky, at the Force Science Institute, which is a think tank for the police. He literally put together it's not a study, it's sort of like a survey of the literature. And his conclusion is that when officers kill people, that it's such a wild experience that they need at least 2 sleep cycles so the adrenaline can drain from their system so their memory can be at its best. That is the scientific foundation for the wait period for the police. That is wild. I'll show you this too. It's interesting is that when we look at the data, so much of it too is myth busting. We got to like push back on these narratives that just aren't true. And Black people are more likely to be unarmed and not threatening, right? Like they're likely to be unarmed. This idea of like the Black people running around with guns and like killing people is actually in the presence of police is not true. And there's so many of these things that have killed us. So you might know that crack babies, like the myth of crack babies, like that, the study was 20 kids or so. I don't know if you've read about the word gap. So there was this huge thing about like the number of words that kids see, and poor kids see less words. Like the word gap study wasn't right. That was a flawed study, but that changed the way we taught literacy in America. So much of our work is helping people sort of think about it. And our communities are often at disadvantages when these big studies or when these studies that are wrong come out and they take up a whole lot of space and move public opinion. We also repeat the truth. Part of our work is saying over and over what's true and what's not true. Now, I don't have a pretty version of this. This is like the version we use. But what's interesting is that imagine if you had a job, and this is the way I talk about the police now. Imagine if you had a job where it was impossible to get fired. And you knew you wouldn't get charged with a crime. Like you just no accountability. If you look at this, what this says is that the highest number of convictions ever, literally ever, is 11 for the police of years that we have data who've killed. The police kill 1,100 people a year. The highest number of convictions ever is 11. I mean, that's wild. And this is something that we remind people over and over. They're like, DeRay, what do you think about training? What do you think about body cameras? I'm like, those things are interesting, right? But if you knew you were never going to get in trouble, it doesn't matter how many trainings I send you to. I could put cameras everywhere. I could put them in your house, put them in the car, put them at the office. But if you knew you couldn't get in trouble, it actually doesn't matter, right? And that's how we think about this. Now, what we often say as organizers is that we have the experiences before we have the language. And that's sort of just like an honest thing. When I think about being a teacher, my students, my sixth graders, they did not have the language about a food desert, but they certainly lived in one. They had the experience of living in a food desert. And part of our work is to get as close as possible to the experience. It's not to beat people up for not having the language. Now, the flip side to that is we also try to build the language where there is none. So, as a gay black man, I am always sensitive to the way we talk about homophobia. I'm always mindful that when we talk about homophobia in public spaces, we really only talk about homophobia that results in physical violence, or like the specter of physical violence. Like that's what we have public language for. I don't think that we have public language for homophobia that doesn't result in physical violence. We sort of shrug it off as like, you should man up. You should like be able to deal with it. That like physical violence is really the only way that we talk about homophobia in the public sphere. And that's a space where we need to like start building language to match people's experience, because we know that homophobia manifests in a host of ways. And it is not only physical violence, even though that is like the clearest example. There are a range of ways. Same thing with transphobia, same thing with sexism and misogyny. So how do we start to build the language when we know the experiences are there? Now, what's interesting about this is that there are 7 places where the police are more likely to kill a black man than anybody's likely to be killed by anybody. And in these places, the experience of the police is real. Like part of it is, and what we have to do is help people realize that they didn't lose their minds. Like they've not lost it. That like we are trying to help them understand that the data also confirms what they have experienced, and that like we can use this to change systems. 2 of the 7 cities are in Nevada. We were on the phone with the Nevada legislators, and they had no clue that their state was an outlier with regard to this. This is what we just did this a week ago, but it's also sort of interesting when you think about the 50 largest cities. As you can read, black people work at a higher rates than white people. You know that there are more white people than black people right now in the United States. And when we look at the killings, though, it is just like it's such a wild disparity. Now, I'll show you this just because it's interesting. When we look at the rates of police violence in the United States, this is per 1 million, so we're accounting for population, is that this is often not what people believe either. And when we think about disparities across a host of things, we're always interested in what the data tells us because the public narrative is often off. So you look at Phoenix. In Phoenix, 1 in 5 homicides was committed by a police officer. You look at Albuquerque, 1 in 3 homicides a couple of years ago was committed by a police officer. It's actually wild. It's not what people think. It is very different. There's only one city in the top 100 cities where no one was killed by a police officer since 2013, and that's Irvine, California. Now, as I close, I'll talk about this idea that we preach to the choir, that so much of our work is actually telling people. So much of our work is actually preaching to the choir. People will say, like, why are you telling people who like already know and did it? And it's like, I remind them that being in the choir is hard work. If you've ever been in the choir, that is not a walk in the park. Like the choir is real work. And part of what we do is we understand the choir director is as involved as a teacher, is as involved as the organizer. What the best organizer does is in community, understands that community already had a gift before the organizer showed up. That what organizers do is help people unlock those gifts, help people see those skills, help people understand those skills. That's what great organizers do. What the best teachers do is that they know that the kids were already smart and gifted way before the teacher got there. The teachers help marry those skills with more content and help them build on that so that they can access that content long after the teacher's gone. My kids should still know how to add and divide, and they should know what integers are long after 6th grade math is over. And what the best choir directors do is help you use your voice in ways that you didn't know you could do. That the best choir director helps you figure out how to use your voice with other people in ways that you didn't know how to do, how to tell new songs, how to tell new stories, and importantly, how to use that voice long after the choir is gone. That the choir is actually a commitment, and we need more and more people to be able to sing the song that we're saying, but more and more people also know how to use their voice. That is what the best choir director does. So I'm always excited about preaching to the choir, that the choir is real work. And what we often say is a chant you've heard, no justice, no peace. And some people understood that as a threat, but we always understood that as a statement of fact, that any place where there is not justice, there will be no peace. And part of our work is to bring that and make that real, that we don't want an abstract justice. We want a justice that says there's a living, breathing Tamir and Rakia and Ayana, right? Like, so much of our work is rooted in the policies and practices that allow that. So we have the only database of police sharing contracts and use of force policies and no knocks. We're leading on felony theft and pay to stay. This idea that all of these things have to work in concert and that the devil is often in the details, that we have to fight at the level of like, this is what the law says, this is how we move the money, this is how we break the system, because the police are the only institution that over the past 60 years has only gotten more power, not less. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, DeRay. We have a few questions coming in. And at this time, I really encourage everyone to either use the chat to send us a question or the Q&A. And so the first question came a little bit, came at the start of your talk, which is about how do we confront and combat affinity bias? And can you say more about one bite at a time?
Yeah, so when I think about, so if I understand affinity bias correctly, it's this idea that we like, you know, we agree with people who are in our circles or like we spend time with. I think that the way that I've seen it done well, especially in organizing communities, is to, you know, we lead with options. So whenever we put stuff out, we sort of say, okay, here's what we want to do, but like we put all the options on the table, even if we know where we might end up, so that everybody has a chance to like put it out there. And we like we let everything go out so that like no idea is unheard. And like we have just normalized that idea of feedback. We sort of embody this idea that like, all the best players have coaches, right? That like feedback is like a normal thing. It's not this thing that people get when they're at a disadvantage, so that we can get over the like the ego part of the work. That's like, I want my idea to win. It's like feedback is sort of a normal thing. So even when I'm leading things or when other people are leading, it's like we try to make invitations. Like, can you put feedback in the doc? Can you send it? Like we like try to normalize this idea of feedback as the only way that we learn and grow. And like that works. And then the one bite at a time. So, you know, there's this old saying, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is one bite at a time. There are two ways that you can understand that. You can either understand that as like one after another. So like I take a bite of the elephant and then like I chew and then I leave and then you come behind me and then you take a bite and then you stand there for a second and then, or you can say like everybody's biting at the same time. Like we are literally like all sort of we're all biting at the same time. And when we think about like the campaigns we do, most of the social justice space is like one bite at a time. It's like they do a big project in January and they ride that out until November. And then they do a big project in November. And like, I get it. That makes a lot of sense to me in organizing. I just don't think that's how we'll beat the police. I think the only way that we'll beat the police is actually having all these projects simultaneously run and run at high quality. So we are trying to press on police unions. We're trying to change use of force policies. We're trying to move the money away from policing. We're trying to create alternatives to the police. We're actually trying to do all of these strategies at once because we know that like pressing the system this way is one of the only ways that we've seen the outcomes change.
Thank you. Our next question is asking about a little bit more information around the word gap study you're referring to.
Yep. So you might know the word gap study. So there's a study that said that like Black kids experience like significantly less words than white kids, and this led to like, you know, a lot of cool things in literacy. Like I think that people actually were really creative about it, but the study itself was only 42 families. And it was like a small group of families that were in low income communities. It's the same thing with the crack baby study. The crack baby study was 20 families. So people at the time just sort of took it. And then over time, people were like, I don't think these 42 families are like representative. I don't think that the study holds up. And the hard part about it is that it's been cited like thousands of times. And people think that like, you know, because their big conclusion was that there's a 30 million word gap, like there are 30 million words in the gap. And when people have gone through it and replicated it, they think that it's probably like 4 million words, but 30 million was so wild to people that like it really did change. I mean, I used to be the chief of human capital in the school system in Baltimore, and I used to hire teachers in Minneapolis. I was a senior director there. That like the idea of the word gap being 30 million, like literally it sort of made us demonize like Black parents a little bit, but it also sort of just shifted a conversation about literacy in a way that like, in hindsight, the study that it did was was wrong, like it could be that Black kids understand words differently, have a different way to think about it. But like the gap analogy, like they sort of like cemented this idea of a gap in literacy in a way that the data actually doesn't necessarily support. So we're always mindful about like how do we what happens when these big studies swing so much of the space. And there are some sort of interesting things about it, but the big takeaway was hard.
Thank you. I want to bring it back to speaking more about Campaign Zero. And could you talk a little bit about the origins of Campaign Zero, how the team kind of came about, where the work started, and where the work is at now?
Yeah, so we were me, Netta, we were in Ferguson. We were some of the original protesters in Ferguson, and we looked up, and the protests were winding down the street every day, and we were like, okay, well, how do we win, right? Like, what happens? Like, how do we make sure this never happens again? And that's why we started Campaign Zero. This idea that we can get to zero, we can live in a world without the police. Like, we believe that, and that was like a core organizing principle for us. And that's so we sort of play in the structure space. We play in possibility. We're always trying to figure out like what is the structural, the policy change. So in terms of what we do, we run a set of things that we manage every day. I can show you them since we're in Zoom. So we run a campaign called Nixon 6 that is the only database of police union contracts in the United States. So there are 20 states that have Officer Bill of Rights. We have 700 contracts. You can find your contract. We code them all. So this took a lot of time. We also run the most comprehensive database of police violence in the United States. So you can come and see the data. You can see the cities. You can click on your city. Like you can do all of that here. We also lead the only campaign on no knocks. So you can find a raid that happened in a city near your state or in your state, because this is not something confined just to Kentucky. And then we map all of the laws around no-knox across the country. And part of our organizing model is that we make all the solutions public. So when we have the laws, we also rate them so that people can see exactly like what is good in the law, what is bad in the law. So these are like the things that we organize around. And we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that activists have the resources. We are now starting to make sure that we focus a lot more on the suburbs and rural communities. Not that we're leaving the work in cities, but we actually want to make sure that we have the resources put where the problem is, right? Like that is what we want to. That's what we want to do, and that's where our work is.
Thank you. We have a question from Morgan that would like to know if you have any plans for running for mayor of Baltimore again, and what are some of your takeaways from your past experiences running?
Whew, a lot of takeaways. I think that one big takeaway was like most of the community forums that were in person, and it's probably different during Zoom, but like there were a lot of forums. It was like the bike forum, the like runners forum, the water forum. Is that the people who normally come to those forums have their mind made up already? So I spent a lot of time, like I didn't door knock on those nights because I was like in the forums. And in hindsight, like I probably could have left those and actually just gone straight to, I could have just door knocked. The second thing is I think that we have to build the public capacity to talk about solutions. I'd be on panels and people would say to the candidates, they'd be like, what are you going to do about public education? And somebody would literally go, one of the candidates would be, public education is really important. And people start clapping. You're like, what? That's like that wasn't an answer. But that is like so much of what political people say that it like that actually becomes much more powerful than like anything else. So that was big. I also was reminded that like a lot of people running have never run anything, right? They don't know how to like lead a thing. They just they've been in politics for so long. And we just get used to that, Like I think that we get used to it. I think that now is a little different. When I ran, people were like, activists don't run for office. You're a sellout for wanting to be in the system. And like that's just different, right? The AOCs, the Cori Bushes, there's like a whole host of people who were decidedly organizers and are now in the system. And that's like seen as a good thing. When I ran in 2016, people were like literally like, how dare you do this? So that is a good thing.
Thank you. We have a question from Ruby, who asked, do you have any tips for organizers or activists when they get an opportunity to meet a high profile policymaker? And how can activists strategically approach such meetings?
Yeah, my best advice is to make sure you actually know the content well. So, most people, and I'm in a lot of rooms where people aren't necessarily sympathetic to like the activist side, or the police got there first. So by the time I'm in the room, like the police have just like solidified this weird narrative that's wrong. But what helps is when you just know the content. So when the the policymakers or the legislators are like, they know the emotional argument already. So by the time they agree to meet with you, like they rarely need you to tell them what's right and wrong. Like I was on the phone with the legislator the other day because they have this bill coming out. And like she knows what my pushes are. She knows like where I want to go. And she's just like, DeRay, what's the language? Like what line of the bill do you not like? Like what like that is like that's what they want is like tell me the exact thing or like how would you respond to the police saying this? And like the more you know the content, it just like sets you up to be really successful. Because otherwise, they will just say they met with you, and that's what they'll say. They'll be like, "Well, I met with so and so, and they didn't say anything," and like you don't want that. So my advice is like know the content really well, know it in and out, prepare for it, and like just know it.
Thank you. Our next question is, in what ways can regular folks, Black and non-Black folks, be allies to the Black Lives Matter movement and social injustice in general, like at large?
Yeah, I think the best way is to like roll up your sleeves and start to do some work. There's a ton of work to do that like one of the things that I didn't appreciate as much until recently is that in the social justice space, um, there's infinitely more work done on the problems than the solutions. So almost all of the space is about problems. So if you think about like things like solitary confinement, which are like mainstream people understand that that's a bad thing, is that if you wanted to look up which prisons or jail use solitary, nobody's done that. If you wanted to look up what are the policy moves around solitary confinement, like if you can't get rid of solitary wholesale in a place for whatever reason, like what could you do to like move us closer to where we need to go? Nobody's mapped that out yet. Like they just haven't done it. Like there's actually a ton of work to be done around almost everything you can think about. I get worried that we've spent so much time on drugs when we think about the end of mass incarceration. And like, I don't know how much I could just show you actually because we're on Zoom, but drugs, you probably heard people say like drugs aren't the answer. Like, we should obviously undo the drug war, blah, blah. But that won't end mass incarceration. It won't take the mass out of mass incarceration. Most people don't realize that the federal government incarcerates the least amount of people of the carceral system. The federal government's a small slice. You could let all of these people out, and that is a good thing for the people. It does not end mass incarceration. And the federal system is actually the only place where drugs really matters. That like half the people incarcerated in the federal system are there for drugs. That is not true anywhere else. So we got to start dealing with property crimes and public order. And if we don't deal with those, then mass incarceration will just be a reality. Like it'll be a cool thing to write about. We'll be on panels about it, but it'll never end. And like people have to start doing that work. It's one of the reasons why we're doing felony theft, to open up space for people to start to deal with property crimes. That like we need to deal with property crimes differently because that is a huge chunk of the overall pie. And that will actually get us closer to ending the mass part of mass incarceration. And like it's those sort of things that like Lord knows there's a ton of work to do.
Great, thank you. Next question, could you speak a little bit about how this conversation has extended in international spaces that you have participated in?
Yeah, I always get worried, right? Like I would get asked, especially early in the protest, they're like, come here and talk. And I'm like, here's the thing. It's the most American thing to teach you how to do something I couldn't do. We have not won. You saw the data. The police are killing more people, not less. So I can totally like help people. I can totally help people think through how to tell stories, certainly how to deconstruct the system, how to think about it. But like we haven't done it here yet. We haven't won. The outcomes are not going down, they're going up, right? So I get really nervous. I get really nervous about the international context, and I try to listen more than I talk in the international context because I'm sensitive that like we literally haven't done it. You know what I mean?
Thank you. So our next question is, what do you think about the proposal to tie police legal fees / settlement payments with police pensions instead of taxpayers from the same communities that face police violence? And how strong is this economic argument today among activists?
I don't think it's strong among activists, but I think it's, Colorado, the end of qualified immunity in Colorado like a came with an accountability mechanism for police officers, so they will individually like actually have to pay something, and that's interesting. I think that people are interested in that, right? Like, I think that that's like a thing. The worry about tying it to the pensions. So I think if you do it like the Colorado model, so there's like a ceiling, it's 15,000 or 20,000 that'll come out. I think that the worry is that when you start to do that stuff, you actually might hurt the victim. So like if you put this weird, if it has to come out of the pensions and the pensions don't have a lot, or it's a big settlement, then your cousin who got beat up by the police might not get any money. Whereas before they could just sue the city and the city had a lot of money, you know?
Thank you. This next question is, what do you think are appropriate roles for white allies and accomplices in anti-racism work?
Yeah, I think I'm biased. I like want everybody who can do policy to do it. Like I think that there are enough people doing the narrative. There are enough people like, I think that the rise in the ebb and flow of the actual protests will continue. Like I think that that is as long as the police continue, that'll continue. I get really worried that there are not enough people on the solution side. Like I just don't, you'd be shocked at how many things you care about. Like nobody's mapped out how to undo it. And you get a lot of legislators who are like super duper sweet, their heart's in the right place. They don't know what to do. They don't know the right bill. They don't know that their bill's not the right bill. They don't, like, and the only people in the space are either like police people or like people who don't have big imagination. It's just like we need a whole new crop of people helping to like actually write the thing and do the thing.
Thank you. So those are currently all of the questions. We have a few more minutes together, and so I'd like to make sure that anyone else who might have a question to drop it into the chat or the Q&A function. But what I do want to just kind of ask as we are starting to close out, right? Like, as you know, we are a school of current and future policymakers. And thing that I keep hearing that I think is incredibly important to make sure that we highlight is the fact that, right, there's plenty of us identifying the problems, and that's not as many of us identifying solutions. And so how do you kind of move to a place of identifying solutions that are as complex and as nuanced as the problems? Because oftentimes we do find folks thinking, like in our example of a mass incarceration, right? Just fix the drug problem and everything is fixed. How do we kind of start pushing folks and pushing, like our students at SIPA to think a little bit more critically, like 2 steps down the line or 10 steps down the line?
Yeah, I think that the best policy people, like, they really do try and sit through all the possible outcomes. I think the worst policy people I've seen are like just really arrogant. They're like sort of, I'm smart. And you're like, nah, it's not helpful, right? So I was going to call, there's a state that is about to do a bill around no-knox, and these people are smart. They wrote this, like they're lobbyists, they're very smart. And they wrote a bill around no-knox that's going to require every unannounced entry to be like recorded or something. And on the surface, that's great. You're like, cool, unannounced entry, da da. But I read it and I'm like, immediately, it took me 12 seconds. I was like, we don't care about unannounced entry. We want forced entry. The police are going to say they announce everything. That's that's what they said with Breonna Taylor. They were like, we said we were the police. They're gonna report 0 unannounced entry if that's what you label it. We want to know every time they force their way into somebody's house, whether it was announced or unannounced. Like an unannounced is sort of this weird thing that is not, that's what the police want. Like, we don't want that. And like, it's those sort of things that we want people to like help tease through and think through and like, so that's what I'd say. The second, and I think this is the hardest part, especially for policy people or like researchers too, is that you got to put a stake in the ground. And one of the dangers about putting a stake in the ground is that like you might be wrong, like you just might be wrong, or you just might not be all the way right, or you might be close to being right, and like, that's the game. That's like what it is, right? And I've seen people be like, people are really upset about 8K Wade and da. And I've seen people when I'm like, well, what are you going to do? And they're like, well, we need this. We need to get rid of the police. Well, how? And it's like, the how is hard. It's messy. It's imperfect. Like, that's just what the work is. And I've seen people shy away from like putting a stake in the ground or like offering an idea because they're worried somebody's gonna be upset about it, or like it might not be perfect. And it's like, you know who loses in that? Our people. We lose. Poor people lose, black people lose, queer people lose, people of color. Like, we start winning when we put a stake in the ground and say, like, here's what we think we can do. Here's what we think is possible. So like when we were like the police shouldn't, like, we should ban chokeholds. We should, like, I know that that is like not enough. I get it. Nobody, like, I don't need a speech about it. I also know that that will save people's lives today, and that's where my responsibility. That's where I hold myself accountable. But like, I know it's not enough. I get it, right? Like, I know that this sits in concert with other things, but I'm not afraid to put a stake in the ground because people are going to be upset about it. Part of what we have to do is like take that feedback, learn from it, and do better next time. But I've seen a lot of people in the justice space just like afraid to put a stake in the ground because it might not be the total thing, you know? And it's like, that's just, we just won't win that way.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Well, it's just like the bites, right? That we need to keep making on this elephant. So we are actually almost close at time. I'm going to turn back my camera on so that I can thank you, at least in this virtual space. Thank you so much. Let me see, we might have gotten one more, which if you feel like you can definitely squeeze it in, which is, how do we help bystanders, both literally in the case of George Floyd and others, and figuratively care about this work?
So I think with white people, you know, the police are just much less likely to harm you. So when the police are engaged in wild things, if you like stand close, or I don't know, like your presence actually just might save people's lives, because like the police are probably, they're just far less likely to hurt you as a bystander. Um, and then I, you know, I'm a broken record about the policy and the solutions, and like just normalizing the fact that we talk about solutions, or that we brainstorm, and that we do it in public spaces, and that we deal with the mess. And then the last one is someone who is very involved in this space, who always needs to be on the top of traumatic news cycles. Yeah, so I don't, you know, the police kill 1,100 people a year, and because we manage the database of them, I like see their names all the time. So I try not to like deal with you know, the news and videos. It's like I feel like I've seen all the videos. I feel like I've seen it. It's all just an iteration of something else. Um, so I don't spend as much time on the problem anymore. If anything, what is exhausting me is that like we are trying to figure out how to make as much change as possible while the window's open. So like, you know, the protests happen, really big window. In July, we could have been like, we could have said anything and people would have felt compelled to do it. And now what's happening, I don't know if you've seen this, but there are going to be some big studies that come out in the next couple of weeks that are going to say that this is the historic year for murders, historic year for like that this last 12 months, historic year, historic 12 months for violent crime in general, that the violent crime sort of began around July. You know, like there's going to be this narrative that like the challenges to police led to more people being killed than ever before in America. Like that's coming and we know it. So it's like I'm trying to get as much done before that narrative comes and then the window closes. And then I'm gonna have to pivot to fight that narrative to open up another window for me. Does that make sense? So like I'm okay. People are like, DeRay, you faded to the background. I'm like, no, no, no. I'm trying to get as much as we can in the window because the backlash that's coming is gonna be wild. You know what I mean? And like I know it because I lived through it last time. So that's the thing that's exhausting me today. Is that like I'm literally leaving this to get on a call with a legislator in the state who introduced this bill, and we're trying to get to them to make the bill work. Because in a couple months, like this narrative of like we challenge the police, therefore communities are killing each other, is going to be wild. You know.
Great. Thank you. And so pretty sure that that concludes all of our questions. Once again, thank you so much for being here. So appreciative that even in this like virtual kind of world that we're able to engage, especially on some incredibly important and current information and current struggles, even though, right, the hashtags have died up down and it's cold out and all of that. And so we once again are so appreciative, and in behalf of not just everyone at SIPA, but especially the SIPA students of color who so hard to organize all of this in the midst of all of the other responsibilities that they have as students. So thank you so much. We really look forward to future engagement. We also really look forward to our students, joining in this work as future policymakers. And so thank you once again. Thank you everyone for joining. And once again, huge shout out to SSOC, to Shani for all of your hard work, and take care, y'all.
Bye, y'all.